There's mounting debate over the situation involving Belmopan resident Guillermo Foreman, who has returned to Belize, but because of the emergency powers regulations in place, he was being refused entry into the country. On April 3rd, following an amendment to Statutory Instrument Number 65, Prime Minister Dean Barrow made the pronouncement that all border entry points were closed off, even to Belizeans.
As a consequence, and after obtaining the unanimous support of the National Oversight Committee, the government of Belize has decided that our borders are now to be closed even to Belizeans seeking to enter the country. Except in the case of those that are returning from travel for urgent medical attention or some other emergency purpose, no Belizean currently abroad can return to Belize. This prohibition will, in the first instance, last for the duration of the state of emergency.
It was a bold move taken by the government to prevent the spread of the COVID-19, since at the time the number of cases in the first wave was spiking. Last Friday, Foreman arrived at the Santa Elena border after traveling for days from Texas. He checked out of Mexico and remained near the Chactamal Bridge because he could not legally enter the country.
I've been here since Friday, and I understand that the border closed, but I've been out here and nobody had a look after me. I don't really get no food. That is food I had in my vehicle where I eat.
5 days later, Foreman is picked up by the police and taken into custody, where, according to Commissioner of Police Chester Williams, he will be swabbed. If tested negative, he will be charged and taken to court. But what offense has he committed?
The Immigration Act says at Section 24 that says that persons shall not enter Belize other than at an approved port or place of entry, and that persons entering by land or air shall present themselves to an immigration officer at their place of arrival. So on the face of it, it would seem that this is what this gentleman did. So it would not necessarily, but then again, this is just my view, doesn't necessarily fall under the definition of illegal entry. My view is that it doesn't meet the it doesn't meet the requirement of illegal entry, because if you are a Belizean citizen, Section 5 of the Constitution says that you are always allowed to enter. So I don't think that any immigration officer has a discretion to refuse you entry, because the Immigration Act is not an act that is for the preservation of defense and public safety. That's not what the Immigration Act talks about. So then we go back to the emergency powers regulations under the statutory instruments. My question is, what offense has been committed under that act? He hasn't. Well, it has to be determined whether or not he has entered Belize illegally.
Attorney Gavin Courtney says that the emergency powers regulations as it currently stands at sections 18 and 19, in his opinion, is not clear enough to determine whether in fact any law was broken.
If regulation 19 had said, if it had said no Belizean shall enter any port of entry unless that person is returned, then the situation would be clear. He would have committed an act. But it doesn't say that. And if we go to 18, we have to define what is entering Belize illegally. And that, in my view, can only be done with reference to the Immigration Act. The question is whether or not, once a person enters Belize because the borders are closed, are they committing an illegal offense? Because the gentleman, I should say, presented himself at the border for an immigration office, he complied with the law under the Immigration Act. Because the border is closed, whether or not that is an approved port of entry, the difficulty with that is we know that there are exceptions. We know that the border is open for persons who need to come back for medical leave. We know that there have been certain exceptions made in the past month, sort of, for example, for repatriating foreigners. So I don't see the argument holding much water that the border is closed and therefore it is not an approved port of entry. But that's just my view. Whether or not that I think would have to be determined under judicial scrutiny.
The repatriation of Belizeans stuck overseas, be that students or those working in the cruise ship industry and others, is at this time being addressed by the National Oversight Committee and the government. On May 8th, Prime Minister Dean Barrow said that GOB was ironing out the details.
We must prepare for the return of those Belizeans that have been stranded abroad. Thus, we have already activated plans for their repatriation. They will, of course, have to go into quarantine. We wish to begin the process of letting our nationals back in as early as possible. It would clearly be before the mass marketing of satisfactory rapid tests, and that is why we would therefore have to carefully manage the flow of our returnees, since we can't handle the quarantining of excessively large numbers if everybody sought to come back at the same time.
Duane Moody for News 5.